Hello, my name is Michelle Chang. I am the Policy and Equity Coordinator at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. I'm also joined by my colleague, Terry Allred, who will be helping me do the slides and monitor chat today. Welcome to How Public Policy Influenced Nonprofits. I have a few announcements to make before I introduce today's speakers. First, I want to take a moment to thank our conference sponsors. This conference is made possible with their support of MCN and the nonprofit sector. And then before we get started with the session, I just want to call your attention to the session tools to help you engage in this session. So if you go down on your Zoom screen, a menu should pop up and you should have the option of opening the chat or opening Q&A. In the chat, please post any technical difficulties you have and then use the Q&A to ask questions of the speaker. And I'll try my best to monitor the chat as well to make sure that questions are going into Q&A. Awesome. The slides from the session are available on the page and feed loop that you use to access this session. You will also receive access to the recording of the session. More info on that at the end of the sessions. At the conclusion of this breakout, you'll also receive the code for the scavenger hunt. So stay tuned for that because that's 50 points. And so with those announcements, we're ready to get started. I'd like to introduce one of our speakers, Jeremy Wells, Senior Vice President of Philanthropic Services, St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Welcome everyone, good morning. It's good to be with you today. Great way to start the day talking about public policy, things like advocacy and lobbying and whatnot. So I'm grateful to have so many participants on the call today. So just a couple of general housekeeping items as we get started. As Michelle mentioned, if you have questions for the panelists, we have about six or eight pre-prepared questions that I will be asking the panelists just to kind of get things off and rolling. But if questions come up, post them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try and weave those questions in. It could be if you post a question and we're going to get to it, I will try and say that as well. If there's small little things that can get answered in the Q&A, we will do that also. No bad time for a question, so don't feel like you have to save all the questions to the end. We will certainly have time to get through a lot of conversation with all three of our great panelists. So let me introduce actually, I'm going to say a couple of words just in general around this kind of public policy topic. And then after that, I will introduce our panelists who will be spending some time with us kind of answering some of these questions. So let me start by saying a couple of words generally about public policy. And so I think public policy is one of those areas that is often misunderstood in the nonprofit sector. Having spent my career in the sector, I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with people that say, well, public policy, that's not something that nonprofits can do or should do, or maybe lobbying. We certainly can't do lobbying. And my response is, you know, nonprofits, A, can do this, and B, actually should do this. And I think you'll hear from all three of our panelists today how they have employed these things effectively within their organizations. Now, there are certainly some differences that we'll talk about with regard to the difference between advocacy and lobbying, for example. So advocacy, in its simplest form, is really the process of stakeholders. And so it could be, you know, as nonprofits, we are stakeholders. Our clients we serve are stakeholders, making our voices heard on issues that affect our lives or the lives of others. Okay, so advocacy is the process of stakeholders making their voices heard on issues that affect their lives and the lives of others. It can also involve helping policymakers find specific solutions to persistent problems. Okay, and so most nonprofits actually can and do engage in this as much as possible. So every nonprofit should actively be working around advocacy to help achieve their charitable goals. Okay, no restrictions on advocacy. You can spend as much time as you'd like on that. Lobbying, on the other hand, gets a little bit more technical. So lobbying involves activities that are in direct support or opposition to a specific piece of introduced legislation. So if a bill gets introduced and you feel strongly that that bill should pass because it would positively impact your nonprofit, your mission, the clients you serve, you can lobby for that piece of legislation, or you can lobby against a piece of legislation. And there are countless examples of where that takes place. Now, while nonprofits also can engage in some lobbying, just like advocacy, the IRS does have rules about what portion of your budget you can use toward these activities. And there are also prohibitions on the use of federal funds for lobbying. So if you're an organization that receives federal funds, you have to make sure that you're not using those for lobbying. So advocacy as much as we can to help advance our mission and those that we serve. Lobbying a little bit more scrutinized, but again, something we probably should do either individually or in collaboration with others. And I think you'll hear examples of both advocacy and lobbying as we visit with all three panelists today. I also want to say something that, again, has been on my mind over these last several years that I've gotten more involved in this public policy space, and that's the relative size and strength of our sector. I've spent a fair amount of time in and around, the halls at the Capitol building here in St. Paul. And I've also spent a fair amount of time out in Washington, D.C. visiting with folks. And as I visit with legislators in particular, they are always happy to take the visit. They're happy to hear the great work that's happening, but I've heard the same thing over and over again. They said, well, it's great that you say that's important, but I've heard from maybe 10 nonprofits this last week, and every one of them has a different priority. And so what happens is we don't leverage that relative strength of our sector. I mean, you don't realize that on a national level, and even in Minnesota, we're a little larger than this, more than 10% of the workforce is in the nonprofit sector. We make up a huge portion of the people that are working and living in the state and in the country, and a huge percentage of the GDP. And if we could figure out a way to coalesce and collaborate more to share our vision, find those commonalities that we all care deeply about and move those agendas forward, I think we would surprise ourselves in the relative power and strength that we have as a sector to affect change, positive change, for the work of our nonprofits and those that we serve. And so my hope in the future is organizations like MCN and others can continue to bring together the nonprofit sector in one unified voice to help advance some of these important pieces of legislation or just broad advocacy activities to help move our work forward collectively. I want to say a word about, again, the differences that I see between what I call programmatic public policy and philanthropic public policy. So programmatic, you might be familiar with. So there's a lot of programmatic public policy happening in and around things like the census right now, maybe around things like early childhood education, transportation, housing. Organizations, depending on the nonprofit you're at, you're probably engaged in some type of activity around those programmatic focus areas in which you work. There's also what I call philanthropic public policy. And so philanthropic public policy is really that public policy that helps advance philanthropy broadly. So it's not tied to any specific programmatic issue, but it also happens, and it happens at both the state and the federal level. So on the philanthropic public policy portion, which is where I spend a lot of my time at the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation, at the federal level, you have organizations like the Association of Fundraising Professionals, you have organizations like Independent Sector, the Charitable Giving Coalition, the Council on Foundations, the National Council on Nonprofits, all working together to say, how can we advance philanthropic public policy? So some examples of that work would be things like advancing the charitable IRA rollover. If you've been doing this work for a while, you know some years we had it, some years we didn't. Some years we get it right at the end of the year and it would be retroactive back to the beginning of the year. There's lots of work that took place behind the scenes around both advocacy and lobbying for that piece of legislation that's now made permanent. And our donors benefit from that, and our nonprofits and our clients benefit from it. Other examples of where we've maybe as a sector or significant portions of the sector pushed against pieces of legislation. There was potential legislation introduced around nonprofit substantiation that would have forced nonprofits to collect and securely store Social Security numbers for any gift above $250. And there was a lot of pushback in the sector against that, and that got withdrawn. I mean, that did not pass. And so, again, this public policy advocacy lobbying can go either way, either for efforts or against efforts. At the state level, again, some of the leaders in that space, obviously the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits, Minnesota Council on Foundations, and some of the things that they're involved in are around annual giving strategies and wealth transfer. Now they're involved in programmatic public policy as well. But Minnesota benefits from being one of only 2 states in the country that has a state charitable tax deduction. So even if you're taking the now larger federal standard deduction, you can still deduct your charitable gifts above $500 up to 50% at the state level. That's a wonderful benefit for the residents of Minnesota to help encourage and promote philanthropy. MCN is trying to expand that, removing that $500 threshold, increasing that 50% threshold. So there's lots of activity about how can we increase giving on an annual basis. I would say MCN has been the leader in that space. In wealth transfer, I would say MCF has been one of the primary leaders there, the Minnesota Council on Foundations. How can we capture some of this huge wealth transfer that will be occurring in the coming decades for philanthropic purposes, whether that's for endowments or for programmatic work at nonprofits? How can we capture some of that as opposed to waiting for another generation of wealth transfer 30, 40 years down the road? And so make sure you're dialed into some of these organizations and put your voice behind some of the activities that will benefit all of us, all of our nonprofits, all of our missions, and those that we serve. So I just wanted to give kind of that brief kind of overview context before we get into the conversation. You may have seen up on the screen, we do have a couple of questions that we'd like to pose to begin with that we think it would be helpful just to get a sense of who's in the room. So if you go to the chat function, I think this is the best place to do this. I know we said it's primarily for technical issues, but this is going to be the greatest place for it. So how many of you do this work? So how many of you work at an organization that's actively involved in public policy, advocacy, or lobbying? Just say, yes or no. I'd love to see it kind of coming through as much as I can. So I'm seeing a lot of yeses. There's a no. I'm guessing about 80% right now, maybe 75% say yes. Okay, we're getting a few more no's. So I'm guessing it looks like about 65 to 70% folks are involved in some aspect of this at their organization. So it's good that we have folks on both sides of that, actually. So I appreciate that. We have one more question that I'm going to ask you to do the same thing to. And so if we can put that question up on the screen as well. So for those of you that are involved, what issues do you work on or what do you advocate for? So just something simple. It might be housing. Yep, there's one housing there. So workforce development, housing again. Critical issues, access to dental care. Transportation's a big one. Housing, food access, education. So let's get a few more here just to get a sense of what sectors people are working in. Financial services. This is great. So we're all across the board here in terms of where people are actively involved. So thank you for kind of chiming in on that. That's super helpful for us to see, especially the panelists as we're weaving kind of our conversations together. So at this point in time, again, just a reminder, I'm going to introduce the panelists. We have some pre-prepared questions that we will ask them, and then pivot over to the Q&A. As we're going through our conversation, as a question arises that we're maybe not asking, put that in the Q&A. I will monitor that. I will try and weave those questions in to the pre-prepared questions that we have as well. So let me introduce our 3 panelists at this point in time, and we'll have them join me on screen here. So our first panelist is Bharti Wahi, who is the Executive Director of the Children's Defense Fund, Minnesota. Welcome, Bharti. Our second panelist is Renal Ray, Interim Executive Director of People Serving People. And our third panelist is John Severson, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Government Relations at the Science Museum of Minnesota. So welcome to all 3 of our panelists. Thank you for taking some of your valuable time to spend with us this morning to share some of your experience and wisdom in this space with those that we have together. So I will kick it off with, I think, a pretty simple and straightforward question that I'm anxious to hear about. and I'm guessing all of our participants are as well. How did you personally get involved in this type of work, this public policy, advocacy, lobbying space? Where did you start that involvement? And let's start with Barty, and then we'll move to Renal and John.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good morning, everybody. I will say that I started, I think, my career in advocacy and public policy. I will say I think I was always sort of aware as a young person about how policies impacted me and my community. And so I think that orientation was sort of already in my head. But my first big girl job out of college was I worked in the field of domestic violence. And if you've ever worked in that field, you'll know that actually there are a whole host of public policies that impact that, from the funding that is available to serving women and children and men experiencing violence. But I think also policies like around guns or around child welfare. So I think that was the first time where I really saw how deeply connected those were. And I think I got a sense that if I wanted to remain working in the nonprofit field, and it just trickled out, whether those policies were related to domestic violence or like a person's ability to get Section 8 housing if they were trying to move, a person's, the laws that impacted what preschool or school a child could go to. So I think very early on, I saw how much and how important it was to understand both the policies themselves, but the process in which those policies were made. Because I oftentimes found that policies that seemed neutral or like a good idea oftentimes veered a bit, right, in the implementation of those policies. So I think that's how I got my started.
Thank you, Barty. How about you, Renal?
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be with you. So my personal involvement in my work in public policy was really an accident, and by virtue of a 2008 recession when I was graduating from law school. It's not the best answer, but it is my answer. I got really broad about thinking about how do I use these legal skills and tools that I had just invested a whole lot of time in, and use that to benefit community. Working in community was always something I was interested in, and I'd happened to always work in the nonprofit sector, mostly in either direct service roles, working on higher ed education, higher ed access, and then certainly working in legal services throughout law school. And one of the things that, so I ended up working at the Council of Nonprofits, working on a statewide property tax exemption campaign, and that was my incredible start in nonprofit advocacy. I spent time again in legal services, and one of the things that I noticed was that as much as our programs are really important, and we need to be focused on crisis response and serving folks with their immediate needs. To me, it felt like sometimes we were putting on a whole lot of Band-Aids or finding short-term solutions to deep and systemic issues. And I wanted to get back into working in that like system-wide, statewide space, and ended back at the Council of Nonprofits. I have the incredible opportunity to work at People Serving People with our families, to center their voices in defining our public policy agenda, and get to work with Barty on coalitions like Voices and Choices for Children, where we are really focused on children of color and Indigenous children prenatal to age 8, and advancing policy solutions that work for these kids and their families.
Great, thank you, Renal. John?
Good morning, everyone. I'll start at the early ages because there were some formative pieces. Both of my parents were teachers in Western Wisconsin, but both very politically involved, working on campaigns, working at grassroots causes. So I remember days with many people around our dining room table, stuffing envelopes and making a difference. So I was fortunate to have a great set of role models. I also too, so that kind of planted the seed for me, and I really took a multi-decade hiatus from the direct work. And so I did work prior to being at the Science Museum at Greater Twin Cities United Way, which is a great advocacy organization. I worked on the corporate and workplace campaign side, so I wasn't working specifically in the public policy, but was taking those messages and sharing them with our corporate community and helping to raise dollars to affect that change. And then when I came to the Science Museum 6 years ago, it really was a great opportunity and a new opportunity for me. I had 10 years of corporate fundraising, but so as Jeremy shared, my title is Strategic Partners and Government Relations. So this was an opportunity to really learn something new for professional growth and dig into the work that the museum was doing. The primacy of our work is really supporting the work that we do. So we do receive a general appropriation through the governor's budget. We do apply for and have received legacy funding, which helps us with our outreach programs and equitable access to the museum. And then we also receive funding through LCCMR, which is the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources, which helps fund some of the scientific research that we do around water quality. So that has been, that was a great learning opportunity. And I'm just going to leave it at there. So it's, it was a period of growth, and I'll answer more in coming questions.
Great, thanks to all three of you. So my next question kind of builds on the first one. I just seeing the responses coming through the Q&A earlier to our questions. I have a sense that our attendees rather are working at all sorts of different nonprofit organizations, caring about all sorts of different causes. So my second question is, who is actually involved in this type of work at your organization? I imagine folks are at organizations with one staff member and maybe over 100 staff members. And so who at your organization is involved in this type of public policy advocacy work? And let's just go the reverse route. So John, we'll start with you on this one.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Yes, I do bring the perspective of a large cultural organization with deeply rooted in science and research. So the Science Museum's mission is to turn on the science, inspire learning, inform policy, and improve lives. And that mission statement was created actually under our previous president, who's now Jeremy's boss. And the informing policy piece was an incredibly important part for him. So to answer the question directly, I do lead our advocacy and public policy and lobbying efforts, but I always say, like fundraising, advocacy is for everyone. Everyone who works within the organization and understands the mission has the opportunity to share their voice, and we do encourage people to do so. From the direct advocacy and lobbying, it's really the president, Allison Brown, myself, and we do have a contracted lobbyist, a gentleman named Tom Murphy, who has worked with the museum for 20 years. So when we are making actual lobbying calls around issues, that is usually the team that is present. Now, we also pull in some of the scientists from our St. Croix Watershed Research Station. So we do expert testimony around issues. So if there are questions, for the Science Museum, data and research drive the issues that we get involved with and really drive our approach to that. So it's a broad-based appeal. And the other big part of this is volunteer engagement. So we will call on our board. We have a 36-member board, which is big, but not huge relative to some. And they bring unique skills. And so we will lean on them to help us in our issues. And it's also particularly important to where they are, from the state level in particular. If your representative is the chair of the committee that we're speaking to, we will definitely have you there because they love to see constituents involved in the process.
Great, thank you, John. Renal, how about you?
Sure. So our public policy program, systems change program at People Serving People is, I think, still pretty young, and it's great that it's young because that means we can shape it and mold it in a way that really aligns with the ways that we want to be working as an organization. This work started out of our theory of change, which is really rooted in early education and early education as a way to interrupt intergenerational poverty and experiences of homelessness. So we got engaged in early education advocacy. That was mostly our CEO and some folks on our education team. In the last few years, we've been trying to really expand the ways that folks are engaging in this work. And as John said, this is work that is about everyone and for everyone, and everyone has a role in the organization. So while we don't have a critical mass of these folks, leadership team members participate in advocacy work and lobbying work. Staff members that are subject matter experts in the areas that they focus on. Our folks on our board participate in different ways. We're engaging volunteers more and more. Most recently, that's really looked like, hey, we're going to this day on the Hill, want to join us? Or you really care about early ed, you're in our classrooms reading to our kids all the time. We're going to do this thing, join us at this event. And mostly our families. They are the folks who are most impacted by the policies that have led to their experience of homelessness. And in our perspective, and I think really more broadly, they're the keys to the policy solutions that we need to focus on advancing. So we engage with them, we try to engage with them on the front end, building relationship and listening deeply around the things that they want to see changed, and then coming and wrapping around to advance those issues. And this is, there's a thing that we've been challenging within our organization around who has the capacity to engage in this work and who does not. I think that there is often this sense that this is the domain of executive directors, board members, and policy directors. But we can actually co-create a way to move work forward that engages and builds buy-in and leverages everybody's strength.
Thank you, Renal. That's great. Barty, how about you?
Well, I think CDF is a little bit unique in that we are actually, from our very founding, a policy and advocacy organization, right? So we were started in 1973 by Marian Wright Edelman, and really as an sort of an outgrowth of the civil rights work that she did during the 60s. So, Renal speaks of, I think, her theories of change, and I think that there are many organizations that are working on the issue of child poverty and economic stability. I think our theory of change sort of drives our policy work in the sense that we really believe that the way that we can best address at CDF childhood poverty and economic instability for families is to really address sort of the systemic injustices that exist. That sort of poverty is the sort of consequence of those injustices continuing to play out in our community. And so policy and advocacy work was sort of the natural strategy for our nonprofit to move in terms of trying to, mitigate those issues. So it's kind of core to what we do. And so when, our mission is to ensure that all children have the best start possible. And I tell people that the beauty of being at CDF, I think, Jeremy, you were talking a little bit about how we can leverage our collective work. But I think the beauty of being at CDF is that we are a multi-issue organization, and the challenge of being at CDF is we are a multi-issue organization. But our theory of change also really comes from the belief that children and families are whole people, whole mechanisms by which individuals move through the world. And so, that is sort of how we do our work. And because we are a whole child, whole family in our approach, it requires a sort of all hands on deck sort of way of doing the work. So, in addition to myself, I think there is a whole host of people at our organization, from our policy directors to our comm staff, our limited comm staff. We're a small organization, only about, only 9 here. We're lucky to be part of a national affiliate that does some support, but it is. And I think for us, it really is not only our ability to work in partnership and coalition with others, because I think as small organizations, that's really the only way to go. But I also think that it really comes from really having an actively engaged staff. I think it comes from having an actively engaged board, and I think supporters and donors and others that are out there doing the work. I think I will also say that it also is about the amplification of community. I think Renal said this best, that oftentimes people who are most impacted by public policy, so my example of domestic violence really sort of hitting that home for me very early on in my career, often have very little say in the policies that are impacting them. And oftentimes policymakers, right? And again, we can only come from the experience that we have, our own perspectives, right? So like, this is not about blaming anybody, but like oftentimes may not have direct knowledge or experience with the issues that they're grappling with, right? And so it is really, you know, incumbent upon us, particularly in the nonprofit community, to serve as a bridge. And we oftentimes talk at CDF about how can we be the shortest bridge between the voice of community and decision makers at a whole host of levels, whether that's the legislature, Congress, the city council, but actually also our state agencies and county partners. Many of you are interacting with those. And not only is there legislative advocacy in education, but there's also a ton of administrative advocacy that happens every day. Because the passage of a bill is only the start of a public policy journey, right? And so I imagine that many of you, and so our staff do not only provide content expertise in the way of testimony and, you know, but we also spend a lot of time working with various governmental agencies and layers, right? To think about how they're implementing the work, how they are engaging with families and community. And I think particularly in this moment when we are very focused on racial justice, on, I think, systemic inequities that have long lived in our state, I think this is really a key opportunity for many who are working in community to be able to bring that component and element to the work. That's all I got.
Great, thank you, Bharti. So I'm going to build on that. We have our first question in the Q&A from my friend Tammy Teskey, Austin. And Tammy asks if you could share how your organization engages in grassroots organizing and or working in coalitions. So I know you were just kind of touching on that, Bharti, a little bit. Can you share some successful strategies of working within coalitions? So maybe I'll start with you, Bharti, and then maybe Renal, if you want to add on after that, that would be great.
Sure. Yes. As I said, you know, we're a small organization, and honestly, I know that there's a lot of pressure in nonprofits to really speak to, you know, like the way we're funded sometimes, you know, you're supposed to speak to like the supremacy of my thing at the, you know, expense of all others. But the reality is like for you to get anything done, for us to really be able to help in whatever way you're helping, right? Whatever, it really is done in partnership. And I think coalition work is the same. And so I will say that we spend a lot of time in coalition work, and I think it is both, again, the joy of my job and also some of the hardest work you're going to do, right? Because I think you're bringing people around a table to really come together to really hold, like, what is the change we want to see, and how are we going to leverage and think about not necessarily how we're going to attribute change to any one organization, but how do we leverage the strengths and skills that we as nonprofits bring to contribute to that kind of systems change. And I think working in coalition, so we do a fair amount of that in the area of childcare. We do a fair amount in early learning and education. We do a fair amount of that. I work very closely with Renal on Voices and Choices for Children, which is really focused on Black, Brown, and Indigenous children and their well-being in the state. We do this on paid family and medical leave. You know, so I think that like we are strong supporters of the coalition work and engage in it actively because it's really the only way we can do it. I would also say in terms of grassroots lobbying or grassroots advocacy, you know, I think that for nonprofits, we need to stop and listen. Like, I think that there's always a danger, and I'm not, again, shading anybody. This is, I contribute to the mess too, but like, I think we're oftentimes seen as experts, and I think the real, it is important as we structure our policy and advocacy work to see like what are our assumptions of where change is going to happen and how it will. And do those match with how people in the community are defining the issue or the problem they may be contending with, how they see their own community strengths, right? Or family strengths that can like really mitigate it. And how are we leveraging our work and policies to really lift up those assets so families can do that, right? And I think that part of our work has really been, I think for us as a nonprofit, it has been to really both invest in staff that can do that kind of grassroots community engagement work, because it's so critical, and to just like stop talking and listen, right? Like, and those relationships and that work takes time. So I think those are sort of some of the lessons that we've learned at CDF.
Great. Renal, what would you add onto what Barty has shared so far?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I don't think there's one issue that we're working on right now that we're not working in coalition on. And what's great is often it's some of the same folks at different tables. Also like a little bit of a challenge and kind of problematic as well. But nonprofit advocacy happens in coalition. Nonprofit advocacy successes happen in coalition. And that comes with a whole lot of mess in moments and a whole lot of joy in other moments. I think, you know, the beauty of coalitions is that you have an opportunity to kind of bring in folks and organizations with a whole lot of different perspective that are expert. This kind of maybe gets to your next question. The folks who are impacted are experts, and also we are nonprofit organizations, service providers are also experts in some ways. You know, when we think about the legislature, it's 201 folks who may be an expert in one thing, but they are not an expert in all of the things. And so we have this incredible opportunity to bring the things that we have experienced as folks who work in the sector as service providers, and also support the voices of our communities that also have perspective on these things, and raise and elevate their expertise and our own expertise in these conversations. I think the value of listening that Barty hit on is like 100% in grassroots organizing. And I think like there is this pressure and urgency, right, that like comes out of white supremacy culture that like we've got to have the answer right now. We need to know what to do now, and we get into this like tunnel vision about what the thing is. And if there was a way to just slow down and figure out what those process points are, so we can make sure we're actually building policy that's going to benefit the folks it really needs to benefit, and that benefits the rest of us. That's something that we need to focus on.
Great advice from both of you. I'm going to pivot to another question here, one of the questions I have prepared. And again, just a reminder, if you have additional questions, post them in the Q&A and we will try to weave those in. John, I'm going to direct this next one to you to start out. And that is, how do nonprofit professionals, those of us that have maybe have limited experience in this space or no experience in this space, how do we grow our experience or expertise in and around public policy, advocacy, and lobbying?
Yep. Well, and I have a few notes around this, and I did share earlier that in my case, it was kind of accidental, and it was the opportunity to bring complementary skills to the role. But then Renal really kind of said it best in saying kind of the day at the hill, you know, the day on the hill, and getting involved. And, you know, I part of my talk on this, or my thoughts on this, is that, you know, if you are in fundraising and you have ever been in a donor meeting, or have you written a grant, I mean, being in front of a legislator is no different than that. It's just the face-to-face version of that. It's about knowing your information and being able to share that, you know, and at the end, the ask isn't necessarily going to transpire in the office, but you're going to have shared the information and help to inform someone. You know, and really at that point, volunteering, like getting involved with causes that are important to you. And I can't underestimate or understate the importance of the day of the hill. It takes away, you know, you've got this giant marble and granite edifice that is very intimidating, but once you're inside, as Renal said, you know, these are 201 people who are from all over the state, from all walks of life, and, you know, they are interested in hearing your voice. They are interested, I will say maybe some more than others, but they are interested in hearing what you have to share, and that is the best way that you can approach that.
Renal, any additional advice that you would offer to that question about how people can gain experience or expertise if they're wanting to get more actively involved in this space?
Yeah, sure. There's two things. I think it's first just the recognition that you already have everything that you need to get involved in this space, right? So like recognizing the expertise and experiences that you bring with you, that you are already a trusted messenger and have trusted relationships with the communities in which you operate, and that you have power. Like you have power as a constituent where you live, or in your organizational capacity that works with constituents that have elected this person into office. So like first is that recognition. And then it's okay to start wherever you start. So whether that's at a day on the Hill, or just talking with folks in your organization or with the folks that you work with, looking up your elected on the Secretary of State's website, requesting a meeting, inviting them to your space. It's starting with relationship building, learning more about the policy issues that impact your organization and impact your community. So I think about the census right now. You know, I don't know how many times the census date has been moved, and now it's been moved up. And this is just a weird year, right? Like 2020, just whatever. But the census is huge for our communities, and having an accurate count means that resources flow to the neighborhoods that they need to flow to, that resources and city council seats can be appropriately distributed. Huge impact on redistricting. So the census, like where grocery stores and where Targets go, right? Like a huge impact on our communities. And so if that just means making sure you send your listserv an email reminding them to fill out the census by September 30th, like that's a really important thing that you can do. And then to register to vote and join a coalition, right? There's a coalition for just about everything. And I bet we could help you figure out what coalition is the coalition for you, or somebody at MCN could. So start wherever you start, and that's the right place to start.
Thank you, Renal. So we have a follow-up question to what we were just responding to. And so the question is, for those organizations that are maybe small, they don't have full-time staff to add or dedicate to this. They maybe don't have resources to hire an actual external lobbyist. Can you suggest other resources that they might consider? So these are the small, let's say 1-2 person staff. Maybe it's 10 or less. And this is not their primary focus, but they do want to get more actively involved. Do any of you have a response to kind of Tammy's follow-up question about other resources they might consider if budgets are tight and people are even fewer?
Well, I will underscore, and being from probably the largest organization perhaps on the board, maybe not the right person to answer, but I think it goes back to the coalition piece. One of the things that we hope to potentially address is, how do we choose what we're going to do? And a lot of this is driven from other organizations who are deeply rooted in the work. So for our field, MCN is great. Marie Ellis and Michelle and the work that they do, highlighting that type of work and adding your voice. Speaking to Jeremy's point, we are one voice, but when we all speak together, we are much louder and it comes across much more clearly. And in the work that I do, I often take the pre-written letter and then customize it to put into our own language and include a few points that are important to us. But then the consistency of the language and the messaging is there, but it also becomes unique to the organization. I know that doesn't solve the budget problem. Quite honestly, this role is supposed to be about 1/3 of my time because of the cycle of how this works. Obviously, in this last year, it's been about 75% or more of my time. But in nonprofits, there's never enough time for all of the responsibilities that we are given.
Mm-hmm.
Renal, Bharti, anything to add?
I guess I would just also say that, it's been my experience. I've been working in nonprofits for about more than 25 years. So, I will oftentimes say, oftentimes we are communicating because we need somebody to take action. Please think about donating or giving to our organization. Please think about taking action, right? And so some of the things that you may be doing may already be aligned with how you might be able to contribute to advocacy efforts, right? Many of you may be already doing story collection, right, about the impact of your work. Well, that story collection could also potentially inform policymakers, right? So I think that there are, like, when you start to assess, like, what is it that we really do to try to communicate the impact of our work? Oftentimes you're also communicating to a certain extent the problem or the issues that you might be seeing in your community, or the opportunity you might be seeing in your community. And you're trying to explain that, and I will say that that connection between how you might be communicating with donors, how you're thinking about, like, how you communicate your own impact, can certainly translate to how you're talking to policymakers, school board members, you name it. So I will also say that there may be things that you can already leverage, right? It doesn't have to be about adding another position. It might be like, sort of, how could you, I love a good twofer, right? Like, how could you take those stories and, like, not only can they be driving your some of the ways that you might be communicating with donors, but I think also communicating with policymakers. So I would also say that it doesn't require a whole new person. And I will say that, budgets are really a reflection of where of the things that we are prioritizing. That's true for state budgets, and that's true for my budget, right? And so I will say that, it doesn't have to be like suddenly you add a position, but it could be a steady stair step, as John has mentioned, of, like, we start at 30 hours and then, you know what I mean? Hopefully it won't be 70 and we are, to Renal's point, like 2020, whatever. But I do think that it could be like a slow and steady movement towards that, not where you're, reassigning a whole staff person or eliminating a position and adding a new one. But I think it really could be like, what additional, as we go into our next fiscal year, what additional responsibilities might somebody able to take on, or reposition their responsibilities to add a small part of this element.
Great, thank you, Barty. I would just add one quick thing that I've seen from experience as well, that I've shared with some of the nonprofits we work with, when they say, I can't afford legal expertise, I can't afford, someone for lobbying or advocacy work, whatever. You might think about your board and who comprises your board, and is there a way to recruit people to your board that provide some of that expertise for you, that can help guide other volunteers. A lot of times those things have to be volunteer driven when you don't have the budget dollars, and so recruiting a board member that has that kind of experience is a great step in the right direction as well, and something to consider. Renal, I'm going to pivot the next question over to you, which is coming through the Q&A as well. And so the question is, I'm wondering if you have examples of ways that we can encourage/ask donors to get involved in direct advocacy. So we all hopefully have donors, hopefully a wealth of donors, a growing amount of donors at our organization. How can we translate their appreciation and support financially from our organization into more advocacy work?
Mm-hmm. So this is like an ongoing conversation at our organization. We have in a typical year, like 6,200 volunteers that come in, supplement the work that our staff do, and provide amazing resources and service to our families. So they're a really important stakeholder. Many of our volunteers are also our donors. We know they care about our organization. We know they care about our families, that they have a stake in the work that they do, that we do, because they're part of the work that we do. So I think one of the ways, and I don't think we've done this quite yet, so I'm curious what Barty and John would say about that. But one of the ways that we can think about it is, this is another way to help us accomplish our mission, right? Like, getting involved in issue advocacy and public policy helps us move even closer to the mission that we know you are invested in, because you support us in the multiple ways that you do. And here's one thing you can do. And then here's another thing you can do. And then here's another thing you can do. So it's just like in fundraising, you're building that ladder of engagement around whatever it is that you're building towards. And for us, we know that our donor base lives all across the metro, and they have relationships in their local community, and they may have relationships to elected. So it's a little bit of power mapping and relational organizing that can also be happening with donors as well.
Great, thank you. John, is there anything you would add from your experience about how you engage donors at the Science Museum?
Yes, there's one quick example, and that was earlier this year, the Greater Twin Cities United Way reached out with a specific request around legislation that was impacting equitable access in education. And I forget the specifics of that, and I apologize for that. But what we did was turn around and use our technology platforms to share that with our members. And part of that was just making them aware and asking them to contact their legislators. So using the power of technology to communicate the issue. We were more or less a pass-through in that particular issue, but the three major tenets of our mission are science, education, and equity. And this was a cornerstone of two of those. So it was quickly decided that this was something we wanted to get behind and share that with our members.
Great. And Bharti, any example that you would want to lift up of a way that you've maybe engaged donors to complement what Renal and John have shared?
I mean, again, I will say one thing that sort of makes us a little bit unique is I think many of our donors are oftentimes people who are very interested in making this kind of change, right? But I will say that oftentimes, when I'm thinking about our communications work, right? And I think John referenced, when I think about our email listserv, I think, oftentimes we are thinking about, is there an opportunity to get people engaged so they are calling, I think for those of us who do the work, if they hear so many times from people in their district on an issue, suddenly like, oh, this like moves up to maybe the top of the list, right? And so I think that we've been thinking, and I don't know that we've got it down any better than anybody else. So if you've got good ideas in the audience, feel free to direct message. But I do think that just thinking a little bit about your communications efforts, like thinking strategically, you're already all probably thinking a little bit about how you're communicating your work. So how can you leverage that in the context of like how you're talking to donors? And I think as nonprofits in particular is a small one. Like I wish I could do, I think, more donor segmentation, more donor, right? Like all of those pieces. But I think what we have done is sort of tried to really think about our donors and try to really learn more about like what really drives them and what really has connected them to CDF and our work, and really think about like, not only can they support that financially, but like, how can we also maximize that? And I think that's also much in the way that it is with grassroots organizing, like just stopping and listening. What really drives your donors? What really is getting them engaged? And how can you know them better? And that's likely work that you're already doing. So thinking a little bit about like not just giving, and kind of donors love it when you're like going to them around, like you're not asking them for money, like you're really talking about something else. And so I do think that there is some power in that they really can appreciate the opportunity there's many ways that they can help and to be able to engage them in a different way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's, like the saying says, if you, wants to ask someone for money, ask them for advice. And, when you're asking them and engaging them on issues that they already care about, that's only going to deepen their engagement with your organization. So here's I don't know, maybe one last question, or if we have another one from the audience, we can maybe squeeze that in. And I'm going to ask this to all three panelists. John, I'll start with you. So how does an organization, whether it's a large organization like the Science Museum or a smaller one, how do you engage or decide which issues you're going to get engaged with from a public policy standpoint? Obviously, you have issues you care about, but when do you kind of turn that dial and say, okay, we're going to get engaged with advocacy or even with lobbying? Where do you kind of make those decisions? Who makes those decisions? And how do you decide when to lean into that a little bit more?
Yep. Well, the short answer is if your financial viability is threatened by a pandemic, then you get very involved. That's not very funny, but it is the reality. I did share that there are, at the museum, there are a number of decision-making criteria. And I did share that it's science, education, and equity. And those are the issues that we are most deeply involved in. That doesn't say that's all we would ever be involved in, but that is the primary drivers. We have issued in the past 3 position papers, which are shared publicly and in our lobby. The first was around evolution. The second was around the science of climate change. And 2 years ago, we released our racial equity paper. So those are the primary drivers. The primacy of our organization is first and foremost, in my role, securing the financial resources needed to run the operation. But that is kind of the core of our lobbying effort, making sure that we are securing the appropriation, getting some of the outreach, the legacy money. But there are a lot of other issues, and the last year is a specific example of that, like really affecting not only the museum, but the field, and using our voice and our platform to help elevate those issues, which are going to be helpful to the entire nonprofit sector. So that decision, getting really back to the question, is that decision was probably run through our senior team. These issues can be raised by anyone, however. That's the important part. We have one of our divisions is the Science, Education, and Equity Division, and within that is a Department of Equity and Access. And there's a lot of grassroots work going on with communities to better engage with the museum. The Science Museum, like many other cultural institutions, has a lot of work to do to better reflect the communities that we want to serve, rather than the ones that we are able to serve right now. But when we do have an issue that comes forward, that would probably run through the senior team. I'm sure our president then probably confers with the board, because there is a public relations issue around that. It's as a organization that isn't specifically known for our public policy work, there is some vetting that needs to take place. But once there is some alignment around that, then we do engage and embrace it quite fully, and do try to leverage all of our communication tools and the position that we have to enact change. Now, the lobbying, I think we're fortunate that we are in a position where we are primarily positive lobbyists, where the lobbying is really around what we are supporting to help do in the community. We have less of a stance, at least in the 6 years I have been there, we have done less to kill or discourage legislation being passed, although we would do that and do that, again, going back to the collaboration across the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. We work nationally with AAM, the American Association or Alliance of Museums, and Aztec. So those are national institutions or associations that we do work with and help feed information to help influence that.
Great. How about you, Vernal? I know we're running down. If we can try and we're down to about 3 minutes left here. So.
Yeah, I'll be brief. We don't have a formal process at our organizations. When I was at MCN, there is a formal process for how this happens. What I can kind of point to is we really try to focus on work that advances our mission, so is really mission related, that we approach it with a racial equity lens. So either in a positive way or quashing things in a negative way that don't advance racial equity. And what we're really trying to do is to center our families and what they want us to be working on. So that I've prepared leadership and our board that may lead us into a different direction in the future, and that's okay if this is a value that we really want to hold on to.
Great. Barty, any last words in terms of how decisions are made, in terms of where you're leaning into public policy?
Well, I think I started with saying the joy of my work is we're a multi-issue organization and the challenge of my work is. So I will say that I think we spend considerable time trying to think about how do we leverage our own skill set, knowledge, right? I will also say that I think part of our calculus is also what are we hearing from the community as well, right? So, I think in the pandemic right now, we are seeing a lot of things happening in real time. And I think we're hearing from community and, just yesterday, some my staff were like, I think it's also about what are you being called to do, right? And I think that we're also thinking about what is the community asking us to weigh in on, what can we do well, right? How do we do that? So I think those are also some of our, of the calculations that we have, but I think as people are thinking about how they weigh in, really thinking about what is it that you do? What are you hearing from the folks that are participating in your program? What do you think you have to offer, right? And using that kind of criteria, I oftentimes ask my staff, are we going to make the situation better or worse if we get involved? Are there people better positioned than we are, right? And I think always thinking about that and what can we uniquely bring that can contribute to this broader effort? And I think those are some of the things that we consider as we thinking about that. And as we think about the lobbying component, like moving to specific policies, I think really thinking about knowing those policies, and we are oftentimes working on policies we're crafting ourselves or supporting others. And I think thinking about, again, how do we leverage our own expertise and work in support of that effort.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists. We packed a lot into 60 minutes, so thank you for your time. I will turn it back to Michelle for just to wrap things up here.
All right. Thank you so much again to the speakers. That was amazing. What a great start to our morning. We're so glad that all of the speakers were able to share their knowledge and experience with us today. As the session wraps up, I want to call your attention to what's next. If you look at the slides, we have 4 amazing sessions up next. Do-it-yourself website, ADA compliance audits, how to better align your communications and development strategies, personal stories, tapping and evaluating their persuasive power, revolutionary fundraising, lessons from the Headwaters Giving Project. So check those out. Also, the code that you've been waiting for, it's Policy NPS, so POLICYNPS. Again, that's 50 points. So make sure you get that down. This session is recorded. By Monday at 5 p.m. You'll be able to log back into FeedLoop and watch the session on demand, and it'll be available to watch for the next 2 months. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.